We welcome in retired four-star Army General David Petraeus, who led U.S. forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, now serves as a partner at KKR. General, it's good to see you.
Good to see you,
Thank you for being here.
Pleasure.
News of the moment, the Senate confirming Mark Esper as Defense Secretary literally moments ago. You know him?
I do know him. I've known him since he was a captain. He's a West Point graduate, served not just in the active Army, but the National Guard and the Reserves. PhD, worked with Raytheon, and was on the Hill. So I think very well qualified, elevating from Secretary of the Army position now to Secretary of Defense, and he'll serve the country very well.
What will be his hallmark? What kind of Defense Secretary do you think he'll be?
Well, I think what he will try to do is focus on procurement for the future, gradually getting us away from ever more purchases of very large, exquisite manned systems into more somewhat simpler, unmanned, but enabled by artificial intelligence systems. So again, he'll be in the midst of helping the Department of Defense make that transition, even as we obviously have to address a number of ongoing crises, continuing the fight against the Islamic State and al-Qaeda, the situation with Iran, North Korea's nuclear program, and the rise of China, among a number of others.
All of which I want to get to. You know Jim Mattis well?
Very well.
You told the BBC in December that you were, quote, not sure that your views aligned with President Trump's on foreign policy. What do you think of the president's approach in that area?
Well, there are certain areas in which I think he's pursued the right course. He did devote additional resources to the fight against the Islamic State and completed the mission that was really begun by his predecessors in Iraq and Syria, although let's keep in mind that what was defeated was ISIS as an army, not the insurgency and the terrorist groups that are now reassembling in Iraq and Syria. He devoted some additional resources to Afghanistan. I hope that we have the commitment to stay there, to ensure that we get it, if there is a peace agreement, that it ensures our national interest, which is to be sure that al-Qaeda and now the Islamic State cannot reestablish a sanctuary in eastern Afghanistan, as they had when, of course, the 9/11 attacks were planned there. All of that when the Taliban controlled the bulk of the country. He's been firm against China, despite criticism of NATO countries for not spending 2% of GDP. Overall, NATO is actually stronger, thanks largely, of course, to Putin and the threat that it poses to NATO, Putin being the greatest gift to NATO since the end of the Cold War, frankly, and also the recovery of the Eurozone economies and the additional spending of the United States. So, again, there are a number of cases, I think, in which there have been good steps, but there have been some other cases where, obviously, there's been some worrisome developments.
Such as?
Well, again, beating up on allies. We need those allies with us. If we're going to have a coherent and comprehensive approach to China above all, the U.S. China relationship being the most far and away in the world, and every action we take, diplomatically, militarily, in trade, economically, you name it, should be filtered through a prism that requires us to answer a question: how will this affect the U.S. China relationship? And if you want a coherent and comprehensive approach, you want every tool that we can muster, and we want all of our allies and partners together with us. So again, certainly encouraging other countries to spend 2% of GDP to reduce the costs that we have for deploying our forces on their soil and in their waters. But we need them with us. And so, for example, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, really more important geopolitically than it was actually in terms of what the economic boost to our GDP would have been, but hugely important, again, if you're going to array countries to firmly deal with the increase in challenges from China. Noting that, by the way, of course, China is not just our biggest strategic competitor, it's also one of our biggest trading partners.
Some would suggest that when they have that we're in an economic war with China.
Well, I think we're in the early stages of a tech Cold War. It appears that the tech world is going to fracture somewhat. Of course, some of that's already taken place. The World Wide Web is not worldwide anymore. There's a great firewall of China that does wall off China from that. And by the way, I should note up front, I'd like to see this relationship be mutually beneficial. I want to see one in which we all prosper from the relationship with the biggest country in the world and what inevitably at some point is going to be the largest economy in the world as well. But clearly there have been actions taken by China that were not acceptable to the previous administration, and are not acceptable to a bipartisan view in Congress, in Washington, and really throughout the country.
So then what do you say to those who suggest, well, it's about time that a president like President Trump stood up to the Chinese, whether they agree with the tariffs or disagree, something had to be done to force China to play by the rules or play more fairly, if you will?
No, I think actually the bipartisan consensus in America reflects that view. And I think, you know, we had an assumption, I think, for quite a number of years and through a number of Democratic and Republican administrations that if you welcome China into the WTO, even though they don't meet all the criteria, they will get enmeshed in a web of trade internationally, and they will get more prosperous. And as that happens, they will become more open, more transparent, and more like us. And that perhaps was valid, but somewhere in the midst of the Obama administration, I think people started to question the theft of intellectual property, the forced transfer of IP, the tariff and non-tariff trade barriers, the exclusion of a number of our largest firms, Facebook and Google among them. All of these gradually accumulated and have hardened into what truly is a bipartisan consensus that we needed to be more firm with China, not provocative. And again, we want to make this a cooperative endeavor wherever we can. And I think we're in the midst of those kinds of negotiations. But there has to be real strategic dialogue between our two countries, not just a trade agreement, as important as that is to our economy and to our markets and really to the world.
Do you think the Chinese want to make a deal?
Oh, I think they do, sure. They're far more dependent on their trade with us than we are on our trade with them. They have to be worried about this tech fracture that's taking place, which, by the way, adds to other factors that are already leading manufacturers to leave China and go to Southeast Asia or perhaps bring it home. Rising labor costs in China have cost them a lot of assembly line manufacturing jobs. Then you've also had the rise of the robot, which means that they can come home to the United States. So we literally see onshoring and insourcing, if you will, to reverse the trends of, say, a decade or more ago. And now you see a concern about supply chain, that if it's made in China, that it may not enter the supply chain, certainly not of the Department of Defense or perhaps the U.S. government, and that will continue. So that's why I say that we're in the early stages of what might be described as a technology Cold War. Again, one that I hope we could come to grips with, and there could be a reestablishment of the kind of confidence that's necessary between our two countries in a macro sense so that we avoid this going farther. Let
me pivot you, if I may, to Iran. And I want to show the video as we're having this conversation about the recent taking of the UK tanker.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
How serious is this issue, not just with the tankers being taken or harassed by Iran, but Iran in general? And what is the best way for the president and this administration to handle it?
Well, to use a British phrase or term, fraught is a way to describe this particular situation. And there clearly are heightened tensions. There clearly is the prospect for some kind of inadvertent escalation, which is presumably what the president sought to avoid when he did not take the strike, for which the military was preparing, and whereas he said 150 or so Iranians might have been killed.
Was that the right decision?
You know, in some ways, it seems like a very diabolically clever decision if that's actually what they set out to do. I'm not sure that it began that way. He clearly is going to have to respond if something serious happens to American soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, our diplomats out there or something like that. And there is, again, a lot of threat that we face now. And it's not just from the Iranian forces per se, it's from their proxies, the paramilitaries, the Shia militia in Iraq, in Syria, in other places in the Middle East. Not to mention Hezbollah, which, of course, poses such an extraordinary threat to Israel, now not just from Lebanon, but also from Syria. So, again, there are lots and lots of facets of this issue. I often get asked, what would you be doing if you were still the Central Command commander or, say, the director of the CIA? And what I respond by saying that I would be dusting off certainly a lot of contingency plans that we developed over the years. But I would also be seeking, I think, a degree of greater clarity, because it's not entirely clear to me what our objective is for our policy relative to the nuclear program, the Iranian missile program, and then this malign activity, which is not just so-called, it is malign, and it has killed some of our soldiers, hundreds of them during the surge in Iraq, for example, when I was privileged to be the commander. What is it we really want to accomplish? And if we have more clarity on that, is it, as the president emphasizes, just the nuclear program? If so, then there's a certain way you could go about that. But what do you want beyond that? Because it was clearly the beyond that that caused us to leave the nuclear program, which had not been violated by Iran at that time.
If investors say, KKR, I'm sure you're asked, what is the greatest threat or the thing that you're most worried about that investors should be worried about? Where is that battlefront?
Well, there are various short-term threats. I mean, there could always be a terrorist attack somewhere. There could be a serious attack on the oil or other infrastructure in the Middle East. Still, not quite a third or so still does come out of the Gulf region. There could be a cyber attack on infrastructure. We saw a blackout in New York recently. Imagine if that had been caused by a cyber equivalent of a weapon of mass destruction, and it didn't just shut the grid down in a small part of Manhattan, it shut it down over the Northeast and kept it down. These kind of issues obviously pose serious short-term threats or could be a shock to the system. The bigger issues, though, come back to this whole issue of the U.S. China relationship. I think that's what markets are watching. Will there be a trade deal? Can we bring this back together? If not, then there are real ramifications because, as I mentioned earlier, that you'll see actually a further reduction because, of course, global trade has gone down some for the first time in a number of years. And you could gradually see really a restructuring of what was a U.S. and Western-led rules-based international system, and it could fragment in a variety of different ways.
General, it's been great having you here.
Pleasure's mine, Scott.
Thank
Thanks.
you so much.